In this video, I'm going to explain what different fabric counts mean in cross stitch and the differences in stitching on different counts and how to calculate sizes from the count of your fabric. So first up, we have 3 different counts of fabric here. Exactly the same pattern is stitched on each one. On the left here, we have the 14 count. In the middle, there's 16 count, and the right is 18 count fabric. And they're all stitched by one of my amazing model stitchers, Angie Sanders. So what does fabric count actually mean? It simply means the number of squares per inch in your aida. So you can see that the fabric is just made up of lots of little squares with a hole at each corner, and you do 1 cross over each square when you're cross stitching. So 14 count fabric means that you have 14 of these little squares per inch. So to find out the count of your fabric, you simply take a ruler and lay it across any section of squares, vertically or horizontally, and then count the squares. That's what's called the fabric count. So I'm going to go here from 1 to 2 inches. So I'll start here. This is the edge of the first square. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's 14 count fabric. And try that again for another piece. So let's see what count this is. We are, lay the ruler across, take the needle, start counting. You're obviously not going to count the first dot here because you'd be double counting the first square. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So that's 16 count fabric. And that is simply what the count means. So that does mean that the higher the count number, the more little squares you're fitting per inch, and therefore the smaller each cross is going to be. So the higher fabric counts give you a smaller piece. This might be a little bit counterintuitive at first, but you simply need to remember that higher number equals smaller squares and smaller finished piece, and a lower number means larger squares and a larger finished piece. So these are the 3 counts most commonly used in cross stitch. Most people will start on 14. I would strongly encourage you to start on 14 and not 16 or 18. It's easier to see what you're doing. The holes are bigger. It's just going to be less daunting. So I really do think that it's a good idea for beginners to start on 14 count fabric. You can get 11 count fabric, and I actually started some stitching on 11 count, which is quite significantly bigger holes, and it's really quite a good way to get a hang of it. Your stitches will look more sort of pixelated, but I still think that they look very nice. There won't be much of a selection of colours available in 11 count, but I think that if you are in any way daunted, then it's quite a good way to get started. Otherwise, go for the 14, which is a very standard fabric count. So it's interesting to look at these 3 pieces, and you can see the differences between them and how it works out on different fabric counts. I think one particularly interesting point is that you're going from 18 to 16 to 14 here, but the jump in size, you'll notice, looks significantly bigger going from the 16 to the 14, even though you might think, because you're adding or subtracting 2 to the count each time, that it'll be the same. But because of the way areas work, and because the count is simply along one edge and not the area, then enlarging the squares by 2 makes a bigger jump in the area. So you can see that going from 14 to 16, it gets quite significantly smaller, and there's not such a jump going from 16 to 18. So that's worth bearing in mind if you're thinking about what size you want your finished piece to be. With 14 count fabric, it doesn't cover the squares so thoroughly, so there aren't any really dark colours in this piece. If there were, you might see more of the white fabric through. And it's also important not to stitch too tightly. If you really make your stitches taut, then that will mean more fabric shows through, which Angie hasn't done this, so it's making each stitch lay very nicely. But you can see more of the fabric through it between each square than with higher count fabrics. And that's really personal taste. It's made of crosses. It's not supposed to necessarily be completely solid. So that's fine if that's what you're happy with. I've got lots of pictures on 14 count and they look great. Then this is on 16 count. As we say, it's a significant jump in size, and the stitches are much more of covering the square. It makes quite a lot of difference that they really are close together now. They form sort of a solid square of colour. The X is almost a bit less visible. Well, it is visible, but it makes just that difference that you're not going to get so much fabric shown through. And if you're using a coloured fabric or you're stitching on dark fabric, this can become more relevant. Although that said, some people don't like stitching on a high count fabric, on dark fabric. And then onto the 18, that each square is getting a lot smaller. I don't think it makes that much difference to the coverage. That's what people call it with in terms of how well each square is covered. I think you get really good coverage with the 16 count. This is the 14 count. All of these are stitched with 2 strands of thread to give you an idea of the coverage. Some people stitch with 3 strands on 14 count. That's going to make it a lot thicker and a bit stiffer. So I think 2 strands is quite adequate unless you're really wanting to have really sort of dense coverage on 14 count. That's something that you can experiment with. So if you are given a pattern, or you have a pattern, and you want to know what size the final piece is going to be on different count fabrics, how do you work that out? So my patterns, this is different Bunny's pattern. I give the size in stitches and the size on 14 count fabric. But you might not have that on a pattern, or you might not want to use 14 count. You might want to use 16 count. How are you going to calculate that from the information? Well, it's very simple. Just move these out of the way. So you take the size of your fabric, of your pattern. This I've literally just counted. If it didn't give you it in the pattern, which it should do, but if you don't have the pattern to hand, you can just count along the edges to find the size of the pattern in stitches. So this is 31 stitches wide by 39 stitches high, and that applies of course to all 3 because it's the same pattern, so they've got the same number of stitches in each direction. So what's the size going to be in 14 count fabric? Well, 14 count means that you have 14 stitches per inch. So all you need to do is take 31 and divide it by 14. So get a calculator to do that. So 31 divided by 14. Here we are. You can just round it. So that equals 2.2 inches wide on 14 count. And we can do the same for the height. So we take 39, divide it by 14. So it's maths, but it's very easy. And that's 2.8 inches rounded. And that is the size of your pattern on 14 count fabric. But what if you want to use 16 count fabric? Well, then you're going to take the width in stitches and divide it by 16. That's going to be 1.9 inches wide on the 16 count fabric. And we take the height divide it by 16, and that's 2.4 inches wide on 16 count. And so on. If you were using 18 count or 11 count, you would simply do exactly the same. And that is how easy it is to work out the size of your pattern from the count of the fabric. And as we saw, you can work out the count of the fabric directly from the fabric itself. So you don't need extra information. You can calculate it all yourself. Now, this sizing, this is literally the size of the pattern. So if I took this and I said, oh, that's fine, I'm going to cut my fabric to 2.2 inches by 2.8 inches, I would have a piece this big, and I'm obviously going to be stitching right over the edges. That's not going to work. You need a margin of fabric. So you mustn't forget this when you're calculating your fabric size. So you need to think about how much margin you want. If you were doing, say, one letter like this for a card, then a margin of about 1 inch is fine. Remember, the margin is going to be on both sides of your pattern. So if you were doing a 1 inch margin, then you need to add 2 inches to each of your dimensions. So for this one, I'd then cut my fabric to about 4.2 inches by 4.8 inches. If you're doing a piece any larger that you're going to mount in a frame or a hoop, like this one that I'm in the middle of doing, you're going to need a more significant margin than that. I've got about, it's in the hoop, I've got about a 2 inch margin on this one. I'd say 2 to 3 inch margin on any pieces that you're doing that aren't really small. So a 2 to 3 inch margin means that you're adding 4 to 6 inches of fabric on each dimension that you have calculated here. So if I was wanting to frame this in a hoop, you can see this is obviously going to be too small. If I wanted to frame this in a hoop, it would go off the edges. So if I was to be on the safe side and add 3 inches, then that would make this 6.2 inches by 6.8 inches. No, sorry, I'm adding 6 inches on each side because it's 3 inches on both sides. That makes 6 inches. So it's 8.2 inches by 8.8 inches. So simply work out the margin of fabric that you want, double it for each dimension, and then add that onto the size of the fabric of the pattern that you've calculated. So yeah, just don't cut the fabric to the precise size of the pattern because that absolutely won't work. If you want it in centimeters, because you work in centimeters, the fabric counts are all in inches, so your calculations are going to come out in inches. Just stick it in Google. That's the easiest way. Just put 2.8 inches in centimeters and Google will tell you the answer in centimeters, and then you'll have that answer. So I hope that has made fabric counts really clear and easy, and help you decide what to use for your next project.